And I'm very happy to be closing out this year on such a high note with Sylvia Lavin, the inimitable historian, critic, theorist, curator, teacher, and I want to suggest, conscience of contemporary architecture. Now, typically introducing Sylvia would involve a recitation of her formidable record in the field. We could list off the many exhibitions, lectures, books, and influential essays she's produced, and point to the way that these works have shaped conversations on modernity, postmodernity, and contemporaneity in our field. We could name the many awards from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, for example, which she's received to recognize her accomplishments. Or we can look at her achievements as a teacher at UCLA, at Princeton, and elsewhere, or as an administrator. We could do all of that, but for many of you, I'd simply be telling you what you already know. Now, for those of you that don't already know, just browse the titles of some of her books. Architecture Itself, Everything Loose Will Land, Flash in the Pan, Kissing Architecture, Form Follows Libido, Quatre-Mers de Concy, and the Invention of a Modern Language of Architecture. Scan these titles and you get a sense of the fearless originality of her research, her productive impatience with established opinion, and her restless drive to press the collective attention of our field into uncharted territory. So instead of doing that, I'd like to take a slightly different, more personal tack tonight. Now, some of you may know that Sylvia was my dissertation advisor at UCLA. She was a really great teacher on top of all those other things. And I was a pretty terrible student. By the time I got to UCLA, I'd been in the field for a while, and quite frankly, I was pretty convinced that I already knew everything. Suffice it to say that Sylvia corrected this wildly erroneous self-assessment in short order. She taught me, as she taught so many in the field, to look again at those things I thought I already knew, to see in my positions on architecture the unexamined assumptions that made them possible. She taught me how to slow down, to do my homework, to get into the archive, and to get it right. In short, Sylvia taught me discipline. Now, there are a lot of ways I could give examples for this, but I want to give two very simple lessons in particular that stuck with me. I want to share those with you tonight. The first lesson was this: don't read in a comfy chair. Read at your desk. And two, take good notes and keep them in a searchable database. Now, these may not sound like the kind of lessons that will win you an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, but I submit that they're among the most important lessons that Sylvia taught me. These simple rules almost automatically make you more attentive and better as a reader and writer. They short-circuit the temptation to engage your objects of study like you engage objects of entertainment, and thus they inoculate you against those objects' rhetorical and aesthetic charms. As importantly, these rules entangle the processes of reading and writing. They break down the erroneous prejudice that so many of us have that reading is pleasurable and writing is painful. And finally, if you stick to them, these rules will generate a very large store of knowledge that will serve you incredibly well in your future careers as architects, teachers, and scholars. Now, I admit I sometimes find it hard to follow these rules, but I definitely try to follow them. I feel guilty when I don't follow them. That's the conscious thing I was mentioning before. And I'm a much better reader and writer when I do follow them. So to close this introduction, I'd like to share with you just two brief passages from my database that I hope will give you some sense of the kind of brilliance that's in store for you tonight. So this one from 2014, Critique Passionnée or a Folie à Trois from Flash in the Pan. SL introduces her anthology, Flash in the Pan, with a brief statement on her aims as a critic. The first is to fashion the present as contemporary. Her aim is to unmoor architecture from its traditional associations with permanence, ideality, and slowness, to allow it to move more lithely in the present. Her texts often focus on marginal or temporal objects and events, such as plastics, happenings, or shag carpet, not to find them their place in history, but rather to make them available to operate in the present. The processes involve making the old new through interpretation and making the recent contemporary through historicization. Her second aim, to draw writing and design together, works to reverse the trend of specialization brought on by professionalization. Here's one more from Kissing Architecture, or my summary of Kissing Architecture, 2011. Sylvia attacks prevailing tendencies in architecture, in particular Greenberg's modernist abstraction, not with critical venom, but with a gentle kiss. Kissing becomes a model for mingling mediums of cultural production while maintaining their integrity. Rather than unified coherence, as in traditional architecture, Sylvia seeks a heterogeneous and provisional two-ness. Architecture's focus shifts from abstraction, unity, representation, stasis, etc., to physicality, heterogeneity, affect, and ephemerality, causing the constrictions of previous regimes to fall away. Two-ness can be achieved by, quote, confounding mediums, that is, mingling architecture with other art practices, to amplify architectural effects and unleash new feelings. Such works, such as those of Pipilotti Rist, produce a super architecture which can also be achieved by insisting on a loose fit and semi-autonomy between previously integrated elements, such as interiors and exteriors. Scott Goen, Herzog Demeron, UN Studio, Greg Lynn, and Jason Payne all provide useful examples, and the theory of provisional two-ness rather than utopian unity signals for Sylvia the possibility of a new politics. Now, I hope these brief passages, written kind of a long time ago, and there are plenty more where they came from, give you a sense of that fearless originality, productive impatience with established opinion, and restless drive to press the collective attention of our field into uncharted territory that I mentioned at the outset. If they did, you can thank Sylvia for teaching me how to make them. These qualities I mentioned are, I think, at the core of Sylvia's project and surely will provide the propulsive force of tonight's lecture. So, sit up straight, take out those notebooks, and please help me welcome Sylvia Lavin.
Goodness. I think they should give you a second PhD for that. I deserve none of it. I really deserve none of it. But I do want to say, you know, we're just coming out of COVID, which means people like me are beginning to go around gingerly into the world again with a kind of a lot of anxiety. But it means that I've been introduced for the first time in 2 years, several times in the last week. And I have heard my own goddamn CV read to me like 10 times in a row. I know what's on my CV, and so it's an act of incredible generosity to take so much trouble to introduce me in such a meaningful way. I'm going to start crying. Thank you. Also, I would change my mind now because I think all anybody wants to do is be home and listen to lectures on Zoom in your pajamas, as was mentioned with Coco. So I'm really grateful that you're out on a crappy evening to hear this, so I hope it's worth your time. I'm not sure that it is. This is a bit of a work in progress, so please bear with me. Okay, so over the course of what is, again, today seeming like an interminable COVID lockdown, the degree to which museum websites have become the dominant interface between audiences and art, serving as galleries, publications, and archives all in one, became increasingly evident. They are now places of record, a recent addition to the long list of recording devices, from annals to newspapers, through which we glimpse histories of the present. Like previous formats, these websites are constantly updated, but unlike their analog antecedents, such documents hide the traces of these revisions within what appears to be an infinitely expandable system of digital storage. websites for museums whose institutional expertise lies precisely in shaping collective memory through the organization of the visual field, are especially effective in this endeavor. And for architecture, a discipline that has attracted the attention of relatively few collecting institutions, the record produced by the Museum of Modern Art in New York maintains particular authority. So on this site, we learn that there are 55 works by Cedric Price online, as opposed, by the way, to 1,811 by Mies van der Rohe works online, but only 29 by Marcel Boyer. So you see roughly where Cedric Price fits into the MoMA universe. And that Price, a British architect who started his practice in 1960, is best known for his interest in cybernetics and flexible space, interests that converge most famously in the unbuilt Fun Palace, a proposal for a media machine as much as for a building that staged and itself performed the dynamic actions undergirding the information environment. We also learn something of the historiography that shapes this view of Price as a proleptic media cyberneticist, with almost no attention to his work during the period of the Fun Palace, and a significant uptick in interest during the past 10 years. This series of exhibition culminates in the inclusion of almost all of the previously mentioned 55 online works by Cedric Price in the exhibition Thinking Machines, Art and Design in the Computer Age, in which Price's project Generator takes center stage in a history of architecture driven by technological development. According to this narrative, digital informatics superseded industrial standardization, creating new productive logics that, like the websites of today, are fluid rather than fixed, spatial rather than linear, and hence environmental, responsive, and adaptive. Price was, of course, not alone in these interests. In fact, they were already, by the late 1960s, becoming as ubiquitous as computing itself has since become, from the Japanese metabolists who reimagined architecture as having the capacity to take in information about shifting patterns of use and deploy it to reorganize a building's cellular structure, to the so-called radical Italian architects who wanted to speed architecture up to this pace of fashion. This, I gotta say, if you don't know, this is a pretty awesome project in Milan. It was a clothing store. Clothing was in these acrylic tubes overhead. Shoppers would come in and push on computer buttons to get one or the other tube to come down, and the dress would kind of come down, and I don't know whether they had to, I never quite understood the logic of how you got the dress on, but nevertheless, this was the idea, totally participatory and interactive, and it was part of the complex that also had a disco, so you can just imagine the thumping of the sound while this thing and the computers are beeping, etc. To even corporate architects like Anthony Lumsden, who conceived of building form as appropriately determined by what he called environmental fit, a design process he understood as unfolding the way a plant grows, taking in information about sun and slant and water, and calculating that data into an intelligent form. So I am interested in Generator today precisely because, despite being pretty unoriginal in its broad strokes, it has nevertheless secured a leading position in an emerging canon of techno-environmental architectural projects, and I'd like to understand why. So, just what was Generator? According to Price, and I quote, a forest facility for 1 to 100 users. Architecture is used as an aid to the exhibition of one's interests. A series of structures, fittings, and components that respond to the appetites that they themselves may generate, a menu of items for individual and group demands of space, control, containment, and delight, a place to work, create, think, and stare, made of timber frame structures with variable infills and cladding, located on a regular grid of concrete pads, continual movement and change achieved by means of pneumatic wheeled crane. I'm just reading from Price's notes. Okay, so I will translate that. Generator was to be a space for performance and for creative people in nature where art was less made than thought about, comprised of wooden huts and screens in a garden setting that provided shelter, which is to say environmental control, huts that could be picked up and moved around, amenable to infinite and adaptive variation. So the cubes, some with plumbing and air conditioning, were to sit on a grid of concrete pads that were fixed, while the cubes could be moved in response to a series of variables. In this particular drawing that you see here, the variable is the sun. The gesticulating human underneath this cube reveals the way in which the operation was conceived like the Fun Palace, not only to enable performance, the one component of this scheme that was eventually realized, but without any of Price's architecture, was the dance project. So performance was a big part of this, and performance was thought to be happening on those cubes. So it was made for performance, but it was itself conceived as a kind of architectural happening. This performance unfolded not according to fixed programs, but to the unpredictable interaction of various characters who made sure that form followed function, literally followed it around with a crane. Price named his leading man Factor. I mean, it was literally a performance that had characters and each role was named, and one of them was Factor, who was the crane operator who moved, combined, and rotated huts according to a kind of gyrating logic that you see here. To make sure, a Factor took directions from the participant actors who were to make their desires known by filling in these well-known activity charts. So this is the program that every person who arrived, so the plan was going to be given an empty one, and they could set down what they wanted, and the program would then be communicated to Factor, who would move these things around. Now, to make sure that participants did not get complacent, Generator also came with a female lead named the polarizer, whose job, like an 18th century salonière, was to keep the architectural happening happen. Both characters, by the way, were real people. One, the groundsman on the Florida property, the other, a recently appointed MoMA trustee, and Price's on, off, again girlfriend, to whom I shall return. Price was concerned about his human collaborators, however, and worried that even with the polarizer present, people would not keep pace with Generator's capacity to change. As a result, he asked John and Julia Fraser, architects who had recently established the Ulster Center for Computer-Aided Design, to serve as computational consultants and to develop a system that would recognize when Generator had become boring and redesign it accordingly. To be frank, it's a bit unclear to me if the problem Price anticipated was that Generator would become boring to humans, or if Generator would itself become bored by humans. The provocation code was embedded in a chip that both processed incoming data and also produced drawings of the new configuration that, unlike typical architectural perspectives, could also be animated. Everything, in other words, was in motion, from the sun to the program, to the cubes, to the drawings, and the feedback among these dynamic flows of energy generated not a building per se, but a techno environment and the first so-called intelligent building. Perhaps the most significant shift triggered by all this action, however, was not the application of novel computational procedures, but a change in architectural activity. For according to Price, Generator was less designed by an architect than it was itself the producer of a new character, what he called the perpetual architect. I'll come back to that in a few moments. The notion that interaction between a person and nature shapes not only character and subjectivity, but produces intelligence, is an idea as old as Plato's Academy and the peripatetic philosophers who moved through its garden, encountering unexpected phenomena that required explanation and hence intellectual invention. This tradition was importantly reactivated in the British picturesque garden, conceived not in plan, as had been formal gardens, but in elevation. Vertically disposed elements like trees and rustic huts were deployed along meandering paths, acting as magnets, bringing viewers, most of them British landowners who had recently expanded their estates through enclosure and improvements, along so that they could take private comfort, now conceived as interiorized subjectivity, when assuming their rightful place as masters of the land, now conceived as private property. Propelled by similar attractors and desiring lines, visitors to Generator were also to find comfort and respite from urban ennui among the trees. The pseudo-naturalism of the 18th century picturesque worked in tandem with theories of architecture, just to remind you, that reduced buildings to the barest minimal articulation, a few wooden posts and a roof, that seemed to spring naturally from the ground in architectural formation. The desire to inhabit this image of natural architectural automaticity became so pervasive that complex machines were eventually invented that could produce natural growth in an instant. Price's elemental wooden hut and visual screens made of trees, techno-naturalized into dimensioned timber and moved about by cranes, created a garden of personal fulfillment, that's his term, where you were free to pick your nose, exhibit your interests, and have every desire catered to. The architect, too, is techno-naturally remade here, cobbled together out of mechanically reproduced and reconfigurable images. That's Cedric Price on the lower right of the screen. The lack of resolution in this collage, this body in bits and pieces without a stable gestalt, calls attention to the fact that the architect, too, is in the process of being reformed by Generator. He is not yet, but only becoming perpetual, a hypothetical figure who, like the perpetual motion machine on which it is modeled, promises infinite action and responsiveness without external energy or internal effort. Finally, the work of the perpetual architect is to generate an ideal world populated by persons who, like himself, are perpetually active yet balanced consumers living in an infinitely sustainable world that never looks empty and in which you never feel full. So this is all to say, in good British tradition, Cedric Price is coming to the United States, his land of Eden, to build himself a picturesque garden of self-fulfillment. Now, in this garden where, and all of his programs, by the way, he called them menus, it's organized around tables, and you never feel full. It's like a perfect model of consumption. What exactly is being consumed, we might ask? In the case of Generator, as is often the case when dealing with architecture, but especially when dealing with British arrivals to American soil looking for land on which to build their new utopia, that which is being consumed, that which feeds this techno-environmental perpetual machine is in fact the land. As you can see, this land. So this is the site. Okay. As you can see, the project was commissioned by Howard Gilman for a site at the Gilman Paper Corporation owned White Oak Plantation in Florida, a large tract of land Charles Gilman, Howard's father, purchased in the 1930s as he, like many other manufacturers, moved the paper-making factory established in the 1880s by his own father in Vermont, moved it to the South, the Jim Crow South, where land, labor, and trees was cheap. The factory was located just across the river from the plantation in St. Mary's, Georgia, and the factory's dominion over both the town and the land is visible even in tourist postcards. So in the back of this postcard, if you see the smoke, that's the factory. Everybody who worked for the factory lived in this town, St. Mary's, and 20 feet across the river is the beginning of the White Oak Plantation. Although John Margulies, a well-known photographer of rural America, typically emphasized the shiny side of roadside signage, his views of St. Mary's show its degradation instead. In fact, by the time Margulies was there, the Gilman factory had indeed decimated local marine life. As a fisherman said, take a crab and throw him in the river. You know what he'll do? Number one, he'll crawl right out, and number two, he'll die. The air was worse, poisoned, according to a visitor. When the wind brings down plumes of caustic smoke, walls and windows are not enough. Gilman smoke seeped into one man's garage and ate away the chrome window frames on his car. The same smoke settles on all the houses in town and enters all the lungs. Parents report that they often cannot see their children playing across the yard, for the air is too opaque. So this land has a long history of such exploitation. When first the French and then the Spanish arrived, the land was home to the Guale people, most of whom died from infectious diseases by the time the British claimed it as a colony in 1703 and established it via land grant as a plantation in 1768. I want to call your attention to a couple things. So this postcard that you're seeing the front and back of is an advertising postcard for the White Oak Plantation during the period that Price is working on this project. So this is how they describe the lineage of this land going immediately back to British colonial settler ownership. So as you see, it became a plantation through a land grant in 1768. By then, enslaved persons from West Africa who brought deep knowledge of wetland agriculture to the island marshes of Georgia and the Carolinas had turned large areas into a rice plantation, which you see here. So on the right part of the slide, you see sort of X-ray views of the rice plantations that were there. And to the left, you just keep your eye on that little circle, because that's the center of Price's plantation project of Generate. Turning the plantation, where they lived in tabby houses, a type of concrete construction that uses shells as aggregate and that had developed out of a combination of African and indigenous knowledge. Let's call them cubes for labor in anticipation of the cubes for creativity that we will see, cubes for labor rather than self-discovery. The Civil War put an end to rice cultivation, and by the 1930s, wood for pulp to use in paper production was the main resource being extracted from Georgia. Pine trees moved via train and river to the factory where, through a process that generated huge amounts of toxic waste that was pumped directly into the air and water, paper for bags and boxes and drawings was made. The entire supply chain, from land to wood to town to factory, was owned and controlled by the Gilmans, who lived in New York and managed the business from afar. St. Mary's typified the political, economy, and geography of the Southern company town, of the sort that began to attract broad public attention during the 1970s. Harper's, for example, said St. Mary's exemplifies the, and I'm quoting, Yankee cult of the great executive who feels that it's no one else's business how they run their town, who hold tightly to the conviction of the right to tell the worker what to do, for instance, how to vote. Because of this invasive and pervasive exercise of power, Ralph Nader came to explore the cult more broadly, studying how these Southern company towns relied on a complex regulatory environment that enmeshed law, business, taxation, and pollution into a system of absolute control. Nader's team devoted an entire book to paper factories in particular, including the Gilman Paper Corporation. In other words, the Gilman Corporation was headline news during the time that Price is working on this project. National coverage came to a head when a 60 Minutes episode aired that chronicled how false allegations of rape and attempted murder for hire of a would-be labor organizer had also become part of the Gilman business plan. Despite this widely available information, and despite Price's typically pro-labor, left-leaning, and critical perspective, Price, too, seems to have been somewhat ensnared in the Yankee cult of the great executive. His view of the Gilman factory is straight out of the company brochure, like actually straight out of the company brochure. These are the pictures of the factory that he has in his archive that he clipped out of the company brochure. A view shaped by the long history of heroic images of modern machinery recorded in photographs like this one, photographs that Howard Gilman, Price's patron and one of the grandsons of the man who founded the company, who eventually took it over, photographs like this that Gilman collected in large numbers in consultation with the Polarizer, who had just been made a trustee of the Museum of Modern Art. Howard Gilman collected many things, including wild animals and architectural works on paper that eventually found their way via Barbara Jacobson to MoMA, the key core collection of avant-garde works of architecture on paper of the Museum of Modern Art come from the Gilman collection, where the generator drawings are now online on a website that has tidied up this complex history with the simple, expedient erasure of the word plantation. So when you look through the website, plantation goes away. So to recap, these drawings made on paper for structures made of wood. Let me just add that as the Gilman Company was sort of getting into trouble, and they had all these trees and they were making paper, but the predator was getting into trouble. So then they decided, well, maybe we can make something else out of these trees, and what we'll make are building products. So they started a wood company, which is the wood that is specified here, which is to say the paper is made out of the trees and the actual buildings were made out of everything. You know, it's all, you get the story. For structures made of wood to be sited on land where wood was turned into paper, that was turned into wealth, that was exported to New York, where it became stored as culture in the Museum of Modern Art, where it got stored in the Museum of Modern Art. Now, I'm totally riveted by a set of maps that Price made that really struggle with his own sense of what happened between Georgia and New York. I mean, he understands they're connected. He understands that he's going back and forth. He understands the site of what's happening in Georgia. I mean, the place was famous for this stench. There was no way that you could go there and not understand what was happening. But somehow, by the time he gets back to New York, there's some process of forgetting that takes place, a kind of magical unknowing. And it's this unknowing that I'm really, in fact, the most interested in. So it's really my contention that what Generator is producing is architecture's forgetting. And I will try to show you how. Okay. So it is my general contention that it is the way in which the Generator exposes the relationship between land and architecture as it was configured in the environmentalism of the 1970s, and the forgetting of this relationship rather than computation as such that explains the project's new historiographical prominence. And so I want to try to spend my remaining moments with you on this question of how to understand architecture and the earth in the early days of the digital era. There's that same circle that you saw before. And by the way, the company got in endless trouble, so the place wasn't built. But now it is a nature reserve, and he collected quote exotic animals, and they still live there. So if you want to see black rhino, you can go there. If you want to see tigers, etc., that's where you go. Okay, so typically, modern architects begin their work by making a plan, which is also, technically speaking, a horizontal cut through a building that is isometric with the surface of the earth. To make a plan, then, is to work the land. Pegboard, still a relatively new technology by the time Price sketched the plan of Generator on it, only patented in 1962, is a device for organizing disparate things as they move across a uniform surface. Which is to say that this plan is a plan, but also a model of how Generator was to operate as a machine for organizing the movement of cubes and peoples across the land. The drawing on the pegboard, although partially ruled, is mostly rough and informal, suggesting an uneasy compromise between the orderliness of the grid of tools, of trees on a plantation, the grids of motherboards, and the disordering of that relentless rationality by the unexpected actions of human and biological behavior. Assessing the relative benefits of standardization versus autonomous decision-making within the context of US labor had become a central feature of post-war theories of work, and was particularly prominent in the writings of business management guru Peter Drucker. In order to call attention to how information, both as tool and as product, had fundamentally altered post-industrial work, Drucker famously coined the term knowledge worker. Increasing the productivity of knowledge workers was, in Drucker's view, the most important task for managers whose job was no longer the simple task of laying out an assembly line, but of creating conditions in which workers were free to recognize new information and recirculate it as value. Drucker's theory of knowledge work and its centrality in what he eventually called post-capitalist society became so pervasive that Price encountered it on the wall of the president of Atlanta's Labor Council. The note below is a note made by Price while visiting the Labor Council in Atlanta, who had Drucker's quote pinned on his wall. Price, however, immediately rejected the mandate, refusing to make a plan designed to degenerate into hard work. Instead, he made a plan to generate creative, let's say, not quite work. So Price is really trying to think about the nature of knowledge work in this period and trying to figure out ways not to standardize it, but to turn it into a system of creative production. So you see in his materials, the materials that he uses, like, I mean, literally the materials, the pegboard and the Xerox machines and these sorts of things, a really profound interest in the instruments of white-collar work in the 1970s. So if you went to an office in the 1970s, you would see pegboards, you would see photographs, you would see paper, you would see computers, you would see generator projects, and so forth. So, you know, it's kind of interesting. So this is the kind of thing that he was trying to do. He was modeling, this is an office. I think what I'm saying is that what you're looking at is an office of the creative knowledge worker. So if we look at the plan for a moment, for more, like what actually is happening in this plan? What work, in other words, does the plan do? So at first glance, it would seem not much more than the bare minimum. 3 lines of water and 3 trees describe the land. A rectangle defines the building site. A curved path tracks movement, and a cube establishes shelter. But the very simplicity of the plan calls attention to all that which had to be excluded to enable this abstraction. The site plan, for example, reveals that generators' boundaries were not self-evident, but were troubled by trees, some in and some out. African bison, definitely out, and by what Price calls slave ruins. I don't know if you can read all the labels, but this is Price drawing what he actually sees on the site. There are animals and there are trees, and slave ruins, bothies is the word that he uses, which is a Scottish term for a peasant hut. These traces of those that had worked the land before him sit ambiguously right atop the line that divides architecture from not architecture. Right, you see that this is crossing that line. This is actually what he saw. These are the remains that are there. And as you start to track the plan, you see that at least at the beginning, this sense of what had been on the land, what had worked the land, that he was adding to his plan, a working of the land, it was all there. And he developed a strategy for repeating these plans. This was an iterative process made out of transparencies and Xeroxes. So it was basically, if you think about what it means to use a Xerox, it's kind of easier to keep things there. You just Xerox it. And you add. Xeroxing makes addition easier. It makes subtraction harder, right? So you follow it along, and you follow it along, and you follow it along, and they're still there. And then, just like at the Museum of Modern Art, the plan shifts, the underlie shifts, and these borders get clarified, and other forms of work that had been there start to get removed. And some encounter with the land slowly, let's say, starts being forgotten. So having become a regular grid with movable cubes surrounded by trees, generator eventually also became easy to model. Right, so here we go. So now there's no traces of anything on the model. It becomes totally abstract with interchangeable sorts of computer code, adaptable to the screen. The planning procedure, in other words, took the disorderly traces of biological and temporal heterogeneity that he found on the land, from the trees to bisons to the quarters of enslaved people, used the grid to convert them into an organized and homogeneous site, and then used the computer to turn every pixel into comparable and hence infinitely interchangeable parts, so interchangeable that what had been there before was forgotten. Forgetting, unknowing, takes design. So while modern architects were taught to begin with the plan, it has been argued that critics of the controlling, surveilling view that such master plans make possible, critics like Price, prefer to work in elevation and in ways that emphasize parallax, or how the movements of upright peripatetic meanderers interact with and alter the frontal view. Price, in fact, meandered all over the site, moving around on foot, in cars, atop a crane, that's him at the top of the crane, moving around, using a Polaroid camera to burrow what he called visual cones through the vegetation. Sometimes he applied dot stickers directly to the Polaroid to represent these view cones that were to be made by cutting holes into the screens that he mocked up on the site. The screens set in the landscape function as pinhole cameras that, like the fluorescent dots, call attention to the view of post-industrial work, like the work of the architect, observing and taking pictures and drawing. In other words, he's taking Drucker's view of the post-industrial worker and using the architect as a model for that, and uses this structure as a way to hone in on this kind of work. You know, the visual strategy, it's super interesting to look at the way artists and architects of this period imaged work, the kinds of things that they did to architecture in order to make work appear. In Cedric Price, there's a lot of drinking and sitting around as work. If you look at the program, there's picking the nose is almost always on one of them. You know, it's a particular model. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, Price's method for working in elevation was, like his planning process, also based on iteration. A photograph is taken, a Xerox is made, and design happens directly on the image, sometimes with stickers or with additional drawing, as if the paper was a screen on which design elements can be added and taken away or rearranged. The drawings were not made using the tools or techniques associated with architects working in the 1970s, like Prismacolor pencils, yellow tracing paper, etc., but rather using the tools of office workers who move paper around, Xerox machines, stamps, stickers, and computers. In fact, as I said, Generator is not really a garden, but an office and environment for the knowledge worker in the creative post-industrial economy. This office landscape had been clearly defined by Robert Probst in his Action Office System for Herman Miller. Probst argued that paperwork was a repository of potential information that needed to be put into circulation to increase in value. As a result, he redesigned the office by eliminating fixed walls and doors to keep paper flowing across desks, up on screens, and through interchangeable panels to keep people flowing around on furniture with wheels. I mean, the parallel to the Price Generator is really quite clear. Even if you don't know Action Office, this was a highly public, pervasive, well-known model of office culture in this period. It would have been widely available to somebody like Price. So this was a spatial model of work based on the idea that the right techno-environmental system would turn the office into a space where new knowledge was created. Probst, like Drucker, focused on the office manager and developed tools specifically for him. By using cameras, papers, and computers, the manager would be able to simulate the impact of different communication event scenarios and hence maximize creative output. Even templates were offered to managers so that the full graphic system needed to design an Action Office could be deployed by someone who drew without any expertise in drawing, as did Price when he drew using stamps, Xeroxes, and stickers. This is to say that Action Office made every office manager into a perpetual architect, just as it is to say that Generator is an Action Office for knowledge workers who contribute to the creative economy by moving paper and images around in order to generate environments in which paper and information appear to be in perpetual motion, even without it feeling like work. So all of these are techniques of what I want to call unknowing. Right? So he draws a plan, he figures out how to repeat the plan enough times that what he sees on the plan goes away. He then converts to elevation, so he's no longer worried about the plan, and none of the things that troubled him, they did trouble him, we know they troubled him, also go away when he works in elevation. He's worried about the difficulty of work and the state of work in the post-capital labor market, so he turns work into a creative garden. Each one of these steps making it easier and easier to unknow the very history that he discovered on the ground in Florida. So here's your action office there on the left. Now Price unknew a lot of things, back to the collections of drawings. So this is by now a pretty well-known, there's a pretty well-known series of letters around an exhibition that took place at the Leo Castelli Gallery, an exhibition that really is understood to be one of the primary places where architectural drawing culture was transformed from something that had to do with moving information around for the construction of building and towards an art practice where drawings were exchanged and collected as forms of art. And what I'm calling your attention to was this was another fact about contemporary practice that Price really did not want to know. He deliberately and repeatedly misunderstood all the letters from Castelli, all the letters from Barbara Jacobson. I am not selling my drawings. I am not going to give Castelli a commission. I'm here working as an architect. I want my architectural fees. You know, everybody else in the show got the program. They understood that what was being exchanged were not architectural services. But Price showed like working drawings. He showed specifications. He really did not get the message. He totally did not get the message. I have to say one of the things that I admire the most about Cedric Price is his incredible ability to not know what was painful. He made one gesture towards the axonometric craze. It was a craze then, and maybe some of you are asked still to make axons. I don't know whether this is part of your drawing culture here, axons. But axons do a lot of things. One thing they don't do very well is convey information about how to build something. They do a lot of other things really, really well, but if what you're trying to do is sell your services as an architect in a typical way, then the axon is not very helpful. So Cedric Price, really just super clever, right? So he makes an axon. He understands that to be part of this new world, he has to make an axon. It's the sign of this new culture, and he does it in the most perfunctory way possible, which is by hanging a mirror over his model at 45 degrees. So when you look in that, the mirror produces the axon for him. He doesn't have to get his hands dirty, so to speak. This is his ethics I'm suggesting. And he can still maintain his unknowing of what's happening, let's say, to his own field. You know, he knew a lot. He knew an incredible amount. He was really obsessed with the trees that the Gilmans grew on their White Oak Plantation. They were not white oaks anymore, they're slash pines. His archive is full of enormous amounts of research on these trees. This is an agricultural project for him. There are no references to other architects in the archive, but there's a huge amount of research on agricultural architecture. Barns, screens for animals, etc. He is thinking about this as a kind of farm, understanding the trees to be part of the economy of this project. So, and he understands that it's the knowledge of this agricultural world that it is his job as an architect to help himself and others forget, and to forget it by the time they get up to New York. So this is a plan of Manhattan. The red is the size of the generator project. It's not just plopped anywhere. It's plopped right at the headquarters of the Gilman paper company. And you notice the other plop on the map is the map that is the part of Manhattan that contains the Museum of Modern Art. Right? So he's really trying to think through here, how do I understand the relationship between these two institutions? Right? What is my job as an architect to try to understand how this works? Yeah. Okay, so this I'm trying to suggest is a drawing of forgetting, right? Of forgetting what happens in Florida by the time you get to the museum. The forgetting that is implicit in working through Polaroids in elevation that work very slowly to cut through the land, to make the ground less and less visible, to even abstract the trees themselves so you don't see where they touch the earth. He, again, was not alone in wanting this forgetting. This here is the frontispiece of the Gilman paper factory brochure. I mean, I don't even know in what kind of universe they could, in good faith, present themselves as an ecological company like this. It's kind of crazy. And let me just remind you, in case I was not clear, that forgetting begins in their corporate policy, right? So when they are in St. Mary's, they being the corporation, hiring people to try to murder the labor organizer, when they're setting up false accusations of rape against workers there, when they're using tax dodges and police cover-ups. These are all literally cover-ups of information. These are a way of repressing information. These are ways of forgetting. This is the tree and the corporate brochure. One is the beginning and the other, and the corporate headquarters. That's the front and end piece of this brochure that, by the way, you cannot find anywhere. If you want to do any research in the Gilman paper company, there's no, it's totally hidden. There's no access. The only one of these brochures that seems to be available is the one owned by Cedric Price. So this, by the time he's airbrushing and so forth in these slightly weird, atypical images of Cedric Price, the ground bears no traces of the kinds of things that he spent years drawing. There are many, many more drawings that show what was happening on the earth than there are drawings like this. All of it airbrushed into a state of ideality, a kind of forgetting that helped the discipline maintain itself as an idealized practice, one that I think really invites us to reconsider the land after architecture. This is St. Mary's today. Thank you.
Sylvia, I think we have time for questions if you're willing to do so.
I think that means if you're going to ask me something. Oh, Jeff. Oh, Jeff is going to just pull out a gun and shoot me.
There's that feeling rising. So I'm going to try to do this. Thank you for exposing the Gilmans.
For what?
Exposing the Gilmans.
Yeah, that's not what I did, but I'm happy for the pretense.
There's something missing. I mean, maybe it's because I fear that many people in this room, the students in particular, don't know enough about Cedric Price to know why he got the job in the first place. So you talk about New York to Florida, but you don't talk about London to New York. You show a little bit of it. You mention the Frasers and Gordon Pass. But you don't talk about the breakthrough idea that architecture is actions in time, events in time, rather than buildings. And that there's a minimum life. We don't worry about longevity. We talk about it. And so this idea that he shifts attention to events in time is a real breakthrough in the field. It changes a lot of thinking, and it's a very positive idea. It had a lot of positive consequence. So I guess the real question I was going to ask you is, how did they find him, and why did they hire him? Not how is he culpable by association with their crimes.
Well, so you're if we can do this in a kind of legal way, which is to say, I just reject all the premises in your question the way you're stating it. It's not a reasonable way to ask a question. So I'll rephrase it as a question. But let me just say, the events in time. Let me say a couple things. If the students don't know enough about Cedric Price, that's your guys' fault, not mine. Because he's pretty important, and that's also the canonic read of Cedric Price. So I don't need to get on a scary, bumpy plane ride. It was really kind of awful this morning to come and repeat the story that they know. So that's number one. Yeah, that's maybe number one, and also number two. Number three, events in time. Actually, I just disagree that Price invented that. That's part of a landscape tradition. That is absolutely a central part of a landscape tradition. And I would like to ask you if you're really aware of anybody doing any work on Cedric Price in relation to landscape. Now, I'm not. Maybe you know the literature better than I do. I doubt it. But it's possible, I'm open. But if we want to go back to London in that period, the Smithsons and Price, all of those people were really interested in the problems of landscape design, because this was a way for them to try to deal with to try to find a way to be anti-technocratic and basically to not follow in Gropius's footsteps, in effect. It was part of the Team 10 thing. So I think that's interesting. But wait, no, but you...
I think my question is, I should have phrased it. Instead of making it more simple. There's the easiest story of all is he's hired to design a swimming pool because of the access. He analyzes the bus routes, and he realizes that if you change the bus routes in these various areas around London, the kids that can't get to the swimming pool can all get easier. He just changes the bus routes rather than build a new swimming pool. So his ability to study the behaviors of people in relationship to building there's a breakthrough in how to think. Instead of every architect thinking, great, let's build a new swimming pool, he shows that it's not necessary. So that's a kind of ethical idea. But more importantly, all over the Pompidou drawings, Pompidou Center drawings, is generated. So before he comes to New York, the generator project is stamped all over the Pompidou Center as one of the indicators. Because even though the Fun Palace didn't get built, the generator model is already being applied to every project he does. So I'm just saying it's part of his. Maybe it's true. Maybe we should have done a better job or done a job. I don't know what they did. I'm just saying it seems to just introduce event in time as a concept in architecture to explain why he got hired would have, I don't know, just for me, raised the curtain a little bit.
Well, there, as you well know, there are lots of reasons that architects get hired, and that's only one of them in this particular case. So for sure, I showed you Baryshnikov. I said there was performance. I said it was happening. You know, so yes, that's an important part of the premise. I think you misread my sense of the ethics of this. I think that one thing that is also true and very frequently said about Price was that he leaned left and thought right. I mean, thought left and lived right. You know, that's the thing that's said about him. So he was a super left in his politics and yet really loved to hang around with the privileged classes. And that could describe a lot of architects. This is a situation in which architects find themselves all the time. They find themselves, very few architects start off by saying, I want to go out and ruin the world. What's the best way to ruin the world? You know, build terrible cities. So I'm going to become an architect. That's not usually the plan. The plan is the reverse. And slowly, many architects find themselves working with people that have different values. So this is a problem. I think I don't know why it's so terrible to admit that this is a problem. You know, when Tom Main is building for Saudi Arabia, this is a problem. And if we can't talk about the fact that it's a structural problem, how the hell are they going to talk about it? I mean, I don't know. I find that to be a thing. And a thing that's worth thinking about. And it's worth, for me, thinking about because I haven't thought about it before, and neither have you. And in fact, we historically stand for not thinking about it. So now it's time to think about it. So how do we do that thinking? And I think this is an interesting project for that, precisely not because of the performance computer event thing, because you can do that with other projects. This one, I have to say, the contact with the history of American racism, the history with land exploitation and environmentalism, it's just all over the material.
I completely agree. You made your case, no doubt about that. How he got caught up there, this is the background. Believe me, I am completely convinced.
Have you asked Barbara why he got hired? I asked her.
In my mind, he should have known at a certain point in time, I need to get out of this. There's no question in my mind about that. And I also knew Cedric, and I knew exactly what you're saying to Ann Barbara. No question about it. So, you made your case. It's just, who was this guy and why he got asked in the first place, and what was the background that led him? Like, how did they know him?
Barbara is working at the museum and developing those shows. I mean, sorry, this is now gossip. She has a terrible split from her husband. She goes to London to get away from she meets Cedric, but she's already helping build with Pierre Apraxeline, building these things. And so she talks Gilman into developing this project in order to get her boyfriend a job. That's also part of the story. And I just thought it was tawdry. Yeah, so this is a long conversation. Sorry.
But Sylvia, let me ask I think related question. You know, like, whatever the line between history and gossip happens to be, whatever the line between culpability.
There's a line.
Yeah, I mean, there's a configurational argument in your lecture, which I just want to put back on the table, and it has to do with the pegboard. And I was sitting listening to you talk, and I kept looking at these walls, and thinking about pegboards, and the idea that Price would take the pegboard, which is normally vertical, in the garage, organizing your wrenches and stuff, put it horizontal to make the plan, which introduces the danger of the plan, as Drucker says, degenerating. And Price turns it back vertical through the legacy of the English picturesque art, etc. there is another shift back to vertical when the plans move not just through the 45 of the mirror, but also wind up on the wall at the museum. And I wonder if you could talk about that. This shift, somehow at the end of the story, Price winds up, the drawings wind up in MoMA. And now when they're seen, they're generally seen vertical, either on the screen or on the walls of the gallery. And so that interchange between horizontal and vertical seems to be a mechanism through which you can trace the left-right swing in Price's politics, the kind of, like all these things seem to be hinging in that configuration.
Yeah, well, so I thought, Jeff, you were going to love the idea that I had a whole theory of going from plan to elevation. But Todd is just slightly, or Todd has clearly revealed that I was totally unclear because that's not what I meant to say. So I think he begins with the plan and the pegboard, and beginning with the plan is to begin with a confrontation to a labor history that he, as a labor theorist and as a committed labor agitator, is compelled to draw again and again and again. And that becomes troubling. And therefore, he moves to working in elevation. It's not that he flips the plan up. It's that he tries to move in elevation where there is no plan, where there is instead endless change, where there is instead perpetual motion, described through the parallax of human experience, right? So the first, I thought, Jeff, you'd love this, that the idea of going from plan to elevation is a move of forgetting, is a way to move away from the knowledge that is built in the plan to go into the more neutral space of elevation.
No, that I get.
Okay.
But I'm talking about the documents themselves.
Yes.
Which, at the end of the story, wind up vertical. Right? So I draw a plan, I draw it horizontal on my drafting table. And then when it's purchased through the Gilman and Jacobson gift, etc., it ultimately winds up vertical again. But not the vertical that avoids the plan. It's a different kind of avoidance, I guess.
Well, yeah, so the MoMA thing is a whole other thing, by the way, because 90% of what I showed you is not in the MoMA collection, but is in the archive at the CCA. So MoMA, as is typical, because Barbara was advising, they didn't take Price's archive. They cherry-picked the few key, what they thought of as the key drawings. She selected the few key drawings, put them in the Gilman collection, and then the Gilman collection ends up as a gift at MoMA. So they're already extracted, let's say, from the flotsam and jetsam of this very complex project. And the fact that they end up on the wall would be exactly the kind of misattention to the facts on the ground that you see in the erasure of the word plantation on their website. You know, again, it's like, what are they deciding? Like somewhere buried in it, it says plantation, but on the title, it's taken out. I mean, just the way, I'm not demonizing anybody, Jeff. I mean, just how terrible would it have been to Mr. Left to think you finally have the job of your life, and you go down there, and what you find is a toxic mess from every conceivable point of view. Like, what do you do? You know, and you design amnesia. What else? Or that's one option. Yeah.
Speaking here as an art historian, not only architectural historian, I often notice there's a very potent slide that we showed where we're in that clearing. And this is where you're talking about the visual cones that he was obsessed with sort of marking out. And, you know, we're looking at an array of these white screens that have these holes. And I mean, it's sort of difficult, at least as an member of the audience not to think there's some echo here of the costume of the Klan. You know, that this is not maybe a purely unconscious transposition from, you know, Klan elevation and the forgetting of it. It's not purely unconscious, but that he's perhaps designing a sort of, you know, an architectural apparatus that separates its, you know, occupants and participants and spectators from that surrounding forest, and in some way marks their racial position or the position of the racial hierarchy. Do you use that?
So here, I mean, I think that Jeff could have asked me the question this way. I am really trying to stay away from, like, was he conscious? Was he unconscious? I have no idea. I'm really trying to describe actions. So for sure, we see that. I don't know how to suggest that he sees that. I was incredibly interested to find that even though when I see something like that, I think of theater, you know, I think of the scrim of theater, and I think of all of the things that you said. I was really incredibly interested in finding a huge amount of research in the archive about agricultural screens used for animals. And so I kind of got stuck a little bit there, that there was some sense that also these are people who are being penned, you know, like a farm animal, that they themselves are being subject to a kind of plantation regime by the absent owner in New York. So I think that the politics of it are super complicated. But I was just trying to stick to what I could empirically describe.
Quick question. I mean, there are many troubling things. In the context of many troubling things, how troubling on a scale of 1 to 10 did you find his labeling of the barracks of forced labor, the ruins of these things, as simply slave ruins, given what ruins meant in the picturesque tradition?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have always loved Cedric Price along with Jeff and everybody. You know, in a world of very few heroes, Cedric Price has always kind of been one of them. And it was horrible to find this in the first place, right? And okay, so he calls them slave ruins, which is so again, if we go back to what the students know and what they don't know, you know, in the picturesque, everybody was designing fake ruins in their landscapes, and it was all very romantic and absolutely part of a kind of upper class thing. All of it maintained by all kinds of labor, and the period of the picturesque is really when the British Empire and its colonies are funding all of this improvement. So if you just want to do a kind of political economy of the ruins, they're also actually connected to enslaved labor in one way or another. So that's one thing. Like, is it weirdly romantic and scary and scary in that way? Bothy is also like a weird term for him to use. He is not Scottish. Not in any working way. So bothy is a Scottish word, and was not used for enslaved labor, but a bothy in the Scottish landscape is a kind of collectively owned shed that farmers that moved around with flocks that moved across common land, in other words, land that was not owned by anybody but was available for farmers around to use. The bothies were places where they could leave equipment and sleep for the night if they needed to. So the bothy, while it's rural and agriculture and kind of primitivizing, you know, in the way that the Brits thought of the Scots, and from the farmers from long, long ago. It was also part of a collective pre-industrial work ecology, which is exactly not what he's finding there in Georgia. So each one of these labels is troubling. It's troubling. You know, if it had been 1950, we might think about it in a different way, but it's the late 1970s. I mean, you know, this is the late 1970s. This is the height of the environmental movement. This is long after, you know, the civil rights movement. This is when, you know, this is the Vietnam War, and all kinds of remnants of what's happening to land is part of the architectural conversation. It's not external to the conversation, it's internal. So I see him struggling.
To go back to students' question about, you said scandalous was your last word, about him knowing, each person knowing his, where I don't know if I used that word. Oh, okay. Like the borders of each person within society, and then not knowing where he belongs, and him living here right next to the plantation, does that fall into scandalous? Is that
I just have a very good question. What do you think the term generator was on?
When do I think it was
Who
going?
started using it? He started using it, or his colleagues, or his people, or when did they start, you know, dealing with it? Like, do you know? Is that
You mean in Price's work?
in Princeton?
I think, as far as I know, it's already present in some of the Fun Palettes material. I think even before, I think it's already there. So this is a term that he used to try to avoid the idea of compositional design, right? So that you wouldn't design in a normal way, but you would organize information in a cybernetic way, and the feedback between your pieces of information would generate a set of conditions. This is a word that was also part of the cybernetic milieu. That's that use of the term. That historically, that's the concept.
It's the same time as past, all those people passed.
Yeah, all the cyberneticists. But one of the reasons that I did not emphasize that is that that's actually a pretty well-known history. So if you want to know that, there are dissertations that are written. I mean, I tried to start by saying that the history of Cedric Price is really been over-determined by a kind of technophilia, a kind of voyeurism of his apparently non-commercial use of computers. Like, what could be better? Like a critical adoption of computer stuff, and everybody loves it. And that's an important history, and it's been written and will be written more and more, and it doesn't need me. I don't do that. You know, I'm interested in something else. And I have to say, the fact that I was not trying to say that generator begins there at all, but the fact that he saw this Peter Drucker comment and thought it was important enough to write it down. I mean, what the hell is he doing in the labor office of Atlanta anyway? I mean, this is part of the complexity of Price. He does his work. He wants to understand what Southern labor looks like. And he's not asking the head of the corporation that's in Manhattan. He's going to the labor organizers in Atlanta. It's amazing. And what he finds in them is not like a picture of Marx or something, but the business guru pinned on the wall. I mean, just the chaos of this historical moment that he's trying to make sense of is, to me, extraordinary. And you know, Drucker was really, we now take this as a given concept, you know, we all know about it, but Drucker had really just coined the word knowledge worker. And this was a fundamental kind of revolution in what we think of his work. And generator is part of that logic. I was totally fascinated by that. Sorry for the
It's important also generator always appears as a stamp. I mean, it was important that everything had to do with
Not always, but the drawings are labeled
almost
with a
always
stamp.
something that's stamped as part of the plan. So it was, nothing was hand-drawn, nothing was handmade. It was about moving into a technical apparatus situation. So the whole attitude about the way the material was produced represented. And Drucker was Viennese. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, from Vienna. He was Austrian. And when he came over, he went to the Harvard Business School, and his publications were all about the relationship between management, leadership, and values. It is amazing, actually.
It's totally amazing. And he didn't, sorry, we'll end now.
More so that he ended up where he ended up as well.
No, but I just wanted to say, there's a ton of hand-drawn material.
I
It's
know.
just that he only published
There
that
is,
in
I know,
hand.
there is, but this is just the whole cybernetic issue.
Sylvia, I just want to point out one last thing, which is in the compatibility diagram that Price made, in one of them, it demonstrates that drinking alcohol is compatible with everything. And I would like to take you out for a drink right now. So thank you very much for a very fast